Goliath, the giant, the champion of the Philistines. You know about him from the biblical story of David and Goliath in 1 Samuel 17. But where does Goliath come from? Although he fights for the Philistines, you may be interested to know that he probably was not a Philistine.
This is the Bible Sojourner.
We first read about Goliath in 1 Samuel 17. He's a formidable warrior from the Philistine army, a fierce fighter who towers above his enemies. Apparently, nobody else in Israel's army even wants to fight him. But here comes this shepherd boy, who himself seems to be too young to fight in the regular army because he's off tending sheep. He ends up convincing the king to let him fight against this giant, which in and of itself seems to be kind of strange since the king is supposed to be the one who leads Israel in courage and battle. The one who's supposed to protect Israel, the one who's supposed to lead Israel, refuses, and instead a shepherd boy volunteers to do it? Something is off. This shepherd boy, who we know as David, represents the strength and trust in God that was supposed to mark King Saul, but it didn't. Saul refused to take action and cowered in his tent. In contrast, David was appalled that Goliath would dare defy the armies of living God. His motivation was not fame or fortune, but simply God's glory. He trusted in God, and what is probably the most epic pre-battle taunt of all time, David tells Goliath, "This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. I will give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves not with sword and spear. For the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand." Well, as we can see, David had complete faith in God that he would supply the victory because it was the reputation of the Lord at stake. Well, you know the story. Using just a sling, David knocked Goliath down to the ground, ran up to him, and killed him by cutting off Goliath's head with his own sword. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, needless to say, they were disheartened and ran away. God had provided David and Israel with a victory of, we could say, epic proportions. Most people have heard this story before. In fact, the story of David versus Goliath is so well known that even people who've never read the story in the Bible speak of this in sports. They call it the David versus Goliath moment, where the underdog achieves something great over the one who is seated higher than them. But even though people are familiar with this story, sometimes there are questions that don't get asked. For example, who was this giant of a man named Goliath? In order to understand Goliath's backstory, we need to go back in time to an earlier portion of Scripture where we encounter a group of people known as the Nephilim. In the book of Numbers, chapter 13, Joshua sends out Israelite spies to explore the land of Canaan. They found the land plentiful and abundant with food, but they returned terrified of the land's giants, specifically mentioning the Nephilim, who are also called the sons of Anak or the Anakim. These were not just tall tales. Did you see what I did there? Rather, the ancient Greek and Latin translations of the Old Testament also understood these individuals to be giants. The translations chose to use gigantes as a translation for the Nephilim. It was because of these imposing men of war that Israel refused to obey God and go in to conquer the land of Canaan. So, because of Israel's disobedience, God sends the people of Israel into the wilderness to wander for 40 years. Now fast forward 40 years later to the conquests which are led by Joshua. The Bible tells us that the Anakim and their giant warriors were driven from their lands. What was their last known refuge? Well, we read in Joshua 11:22 that the Anakim were driven into the cities of Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod, all Philistine strongholds. By the way, where does 1 Samuel 17 say that Goliath is from? In Gath. one of those cities mentioned in Joshua 11 as a refuge of the Anakim. So if you're tracking with me, and I hope that you are, the pieces of the puzzle should begin to fit together a little bit. Goliath comes from Gath, and he's described explicitly as a giant, and this in turn aligns perfectly with the descriptions that we see of the Anakim from Numbers 13. This seems to make a compelling case that Goliath was indeed a descendant of Anak, a Nephilim himself, something we would refer to as a giant. But Goliath wasn't alone. The Bible actually recounts other giants fighting alongside the Philistines, such as Ishbi-Benob and Soph, also referred to as the descendants of the giants in 2 Samuel 21. Their presence in Philistine battles suggests that the Anakim, having been displaced centuries earlier, were still around and now allies of the Philistines. Interestingly, 2 Samuel 21 and 1 Chronicles 20 both specifically say that all these giants were descended from Gath. Where was Goliath from again? This detail seems to support the idea that the giants were specifically found where the Anakim took refuge, and they weren't just from the general Philistine population. This also argues that these giants weren't technically Philistines. They were probably Anakim. So what does all this mean? When we look through all the details, in many ways, when we read about David versus Goliath, it's more than just a tale of a simple giant versus a shepherd boy. It's actually a reminder that because the Anakim escaped during Joshua's time, Israel continued to be oppressed by the descendants of Anak for centuries. But also, through the Anakim and their imposing warriors, God was able to show his ability to empower and protect his people. No matter the obstacle, God continued to be faithful to his promises, both to Abraham and then later to David. God is always faithful to his promises. And in this regard, well, let's just say this story isn't a tall tale. Thanks for joining me. If you've enjoyed this discussion of history and significance of Goliath, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share. Or don't. I, unlike David, have no skills with a sling and will not be hunting you down. How about you? Do you agree that Goliath was from the Anakim? Maybe you have a different idea. Let me know in the comments below. Until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you, and make his face shine upon you.